Hello and welcome back to Protect Life here at Breaking the Consensus. I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. We'll be talking to Dr. Brendan Crowley, but before we get to talk to Brendan, I'd first like you to see that subscribe button, click on that, and anything new that we have for you, you will be advised of. Also, you see the donate button there. Anything you can do to help us out in the work that we're doing would be really most great appreciated. Dr. Brendan Crowley, Brendan, you're a GP in practice in East Cork, is that right?
Yeah,
Just tell us just a bit where you are and what you're doing.
yeah. So thanks very much for having me on, Michael. Yeah, correct. So I'm working as a GP in the Cork area, and have been for the last 10 years or so. Have been lucky enough to within the training for that to work in palliative care and also in obstetrics and gynecology and other areas of medicine. So yeah, I suppose just delighted to be on and delighted to contribute in any way I can.
So, Brendan, you're on because we'll start off first. You wrote an article for the Irish Medical Times,
Correct.
and broadly on the subject of ethics and conscience rights in Ireland. We're now living in a new dispensation. It was a different dispensation to one when you started studying medicine. We had the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment is now gone. Abortion has been legislated for and is legal and practiced throughout the jurisdiction of the Republic. So, first of all, could you just give us a sense of what your article was about?
Yeah, so the article, as you say, was set on the context of the 3 year review, the 3 year review into the abortion legislation that was promised by the government. And essentially, I think, to say it from the outset, the review itself, was hugely biased. I think that's very clear. The people involved in the review process never consulted anyone with a pro-life position. And so, it was set from the start to create a narrative that abortion is and will be continue to be the solution for women in crisis pregnancy. So I think it's important to set the tone with that. So, the goalposts have clearly shifted, as you say, since the Eighth Amendment was removed. We're now in a position where abortion is legal in Ireland, and where doctors and largely GPs in the main are being tasked with carrying out these life-ending procedures. So, it's a fundamental shift in medical ethics, and not surprisingly, as a result of this, doctors and many of whom are being forced or attempted to being forced to become part of the process. And I think reassuringly, 90% of GPs, upwards of 90% of GPs, despite huge financial incentives offered by the government and other institutions to carry out the abortions, 90% of GPs, upwards of that, are still not carrying them out, and they're refusing to do so. So it would appear that there's a problem, or at least that's the narrative that's been given, that there's a problem of access and so on like this. And again, the line is that it's all healthcare, and again, it's a corruption of language around it. There's an attempt, as I said, to force doctors to comply, whether that's directly or indirectly. And so to force doctors to do this, there's an obligation on those doing so to erode freedom of conscience rights. Mm-hmm. So freedom of conscience, I suppose, just to set it, and your listeners will be familiar with it, but I mean, freedom of conscience is a fundamental right. It's a right that's enshrined in our own constitution, 44.2.1, and also it's a fundamental right that's woven into European law also. And what we see in the report from the 3 year review is this attempt, as they describe it, to balance rights. And as we know, we can't balance fundamental rights. So they've set upon trying to erode freedom of conscience in an attempt to suppress and to force the 8 remaining hospitals, maternity hospitals, that being, who aren't currently carrying out abortions, to do so. Mm-hmm. They're carrying, the suggestion of value clarification workshops. I mean, this is just it's an attempt at singular groupthink. Simple as that. And they're attempting, and as is in existence at the moment, the freedom of conscience, as it currently applies to doctors, is as what I'd refer to as a pretend freedom of conscience. So whilst a doctor, nurse, or midwife, and they are the only groups that even are protected, if you want to call it that, by this pretend freedom of conscience, a doctor, nurse, or midwife at the current time can decide to not partake in an abortion. However, in a doctor's case, he or she is obliged to make sure that it happens once the request is made.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this, as I said, this is a complete, it's abhorrent essentially to any medical professional who's, you know, started out their career in attempt to heal, not harm, and to protect people, and to practice medicine in that fashion. So it's a complete inverse of those principles, and the government know that, and the lobby groups, they know that. So they clearly have to, as I say, you know, to weave the story around it, that it's healthcare and that it's helpful and so on like that. So I think it's important that we focus on that freedom of conscience.
Sorry, just before we get into more of the meat of the specific issue tonight, you brought up the subject of the 3-year review, and you mentioned the fact that they effectively excluded alternative voices on the subject. I don't want to put you on the spot here, but you've been following it a bit, I know. But one of the things that I think shocked, well, not shocked, saddened certainly a lot of people, was the speed at which the number of abortions taking place has occurred, the acceleration. Now, we were told when people said that legalization of abortion will actually increase the number of abortions that take place, that this was not true during this was one more of the scaremongering tactics that people who wanted to save the eighth were responsible for, which turned out to be true. Was there, in the review, was there any sense that even in the context of this number going up, we still see pressure coming on, am I right, to see the waiting period, for example,
Correct.
to be abolished? In your own from your perspective, why do you think, what is going on there? Did you get any sense that there was a concern about lowering the number of abortions, or have we gone from this dictum of, you know, safe, legal, and rare to now, oh, it's just medical, it's just healthcare, and it's not a big deal, and we shouldn't care about it? Was there any sense in this review that these numbers have gone up much more quickly, and we should actually be looking at ways that we can reduce them, or was it simply a question of managing it?
So I think, you know, when you look at the report, it's very, very clear that this is all about maximizing abortion, the access to it, and increasing the numbers. And that's a really, really perverse way to look at this. As you say, the phrase that was bandied about around the time of the referendum in order to reassure those who were perhaps on the fence was that safe, legal, and rare. Well, that's certainly not the case. I mean, already, even with the current legislation, before the 3-year review, suggestions may or may not be taken into effect, we've already seen an increase of 70%, you know, on baseline numbers in terms of abortion figures. More than 20,000 young boys and girls, preborn boys and girls, have lost their lives since this legislation has come into effect. And as you rightly say, that the 3-day waiting period, I mean, this is a piece of legislation that has very clearly saved lives between the years of 2019 and 2021. More than 4,000 lives were saved by this. So this, as people probably know, is a piece of the legislation that was put in as a safeguard, again, to try and reassure those who were uncertain about the vote. And it was there, and it was a very good piece to add to the legislation, and allowed a woman a time to reflect, and allowed her time to gain supports and to access supports if she could do so, and to change her mind. And as I say, 4,000 women, upwards of 4,000 women, changed their minds during that period. And as you know, parliamentary questions made it very clear that none of those 4,000 women were asked to take part in the review, and yet there was a very singular dictum made to remove it and to scrap that piece of legislation. And how anyone can stand over that, you know, in a society which purports to be supportive of people and to protect people, I really don't know. And it's a really dark move, I feel.
You adverted to the fact that the way abortion is being delivered in the country, that the burden falls principally on general practitioners. Is that right?
Correct.
So how is it being delivered? How is it? How does that work out with the numbers and the methodologies?
So So up until 12 weeks, as people know, that an abortion can be carried out for any reason. After that, there's certain, let's say, safeguards around it, which it has to pass by a couple of hospital consultants and so on like that. But up to that time period, and up to 9 weeks in particular, GPs largely are those who are involved in carrying this out. And as I say, thankfully, the people have in the main, the vast majority of GPs have abstained from getting involved. And when you think of it, and this is a shocking piece of information around this, a GP who carries out antenatal care, which may involve up to 12 visits, 2 of which will involve caring for the mother and child postnatally at 2 and 6 weeks. A GP in that situation will receive €250 remuneration for that. A GP who carries out an abortion, which is maximally 3 visits, one of which can be a virtual visit, receives €450. So that'll tell you exactly where the government's value system is with all this. I mean, it's absolutely shocking, to see it in action. But unfortunately, that's the way this is. That there's a singular narrative, as I say, around this, and anyone who speaks out against it, they'll attempt to silence. And I think, when you look at conscience, and as I say, the importance of it, it's obviously hugely important in a free society. But I think when you look at medicine in particular, we have to look at what the role of a doctor is in society. So a doctor's role, I think we remind ourselves, is not a neutral one. A doctor is there to act with what we call beneficence and non-maleficence. So doctor is there to heal, not to harm, essentially. And he or she must rely on evidence-based medicine in order to do that. And so people and wider society by extension need to trust doctors. If this is to work at all, they need to trust that doctors have freedom within their scope to actually practice good medicine and practice in their best interests. And in fact, the Irish Medical Council, the guidelines, they clearly state that medicine must not be used as a tool by the state. It said each doctor must be free to use his or her clinical judgment to make decisions which are in his or her patient's best interest, and medicine must not be abused, as I say, by the state. So it says that, and yet, further down the legislation, it's attempting to force a doctor against his or her better clinical judgment to not alone end the life of one patient, but to go against his or her better judgment, looking at the peer-reviewed evidence on the topic, and to point a woman at the very least in the direction which is potentially gravely harmful for her. So it's a really, really dangerous move. Like that, we're talking here not about evidence-based medicine anymore. We're talking about state-sponsored medicine. The state is literally sitting inside in the consultation room, and wherever anyone stands on the issue of abortion, whether you're pro-abortion or whether you're pro-life, this is serious. This is extremely serious, because this is a fundamental shift. You don't want your doctor strapped with his or her hands behind their back. They have to be free to use their tools appropriately.
Now, you pointed out that up to 90% of GPs, as of yet, are unwilling to participate in abortion services, right?
Right.
Now, the argument that will be made, and has been made, say, in the European courts, and has been made a number of times by people who oppose a sort of a wide or a strong understanding of the conscience rights for medical professionals, is that this is healthcare, and you have to provide it, that people have a right to healthcare, and that conscience rights in this case are actually an impediment to access, and 90% of GPs not offering it. Right now, what is your legal standing? What can you do and what can't you do? Like, I know the original setup was that the protection would be that every doctor, every GP would have the right not to prescribe, for example, the abortifacients or the pharmaceuticals, but would be required to refer the patient to a medical practitioner who would. So what is the situation right now? What is your legal requirement? What are your protections as we stand?
So you've outlined it really well, Michael. I mean, essentially that is the legal situation. So as a doctor, I can refuse to carry out the abortion, but under law, I'm obliged to point the woman in the direction of those who will provide the abortion. Clearly, on a conscience level, that's a complete non-runner, for the reasons I've outlined in the previous point. So, I mean, we that's just not done. And I suppose what's done, and again, this is where it comes back to the fundamentals. I mean, there's an abuse of language from the very start, the calling this healthcare when the definition is to deliberately ending the life of an unborn child. I think we need to call that each and every time. There's absolutely nothing about this which you can actually fit in under the definition of healthcare. And similarly, as I said, even if you take the ethics out of this, if that's possible, and take out the grotesque nature of what is actually involved in the abortion, as an intervention, if we want to call it a clinical intervention, the false presupposition at the moment is that, well, it must be proven, and one would be forgiven given the the tidal wave of opinion in this direction, that it must be proven at some level that an abortion, despite its the horror involved, must still be helpful for women. And the converse is the truth. And I think when we look at it, and we look at the highest peer-reviewed evidence-based studies that are done in this, and they're largely carried out by Professor David Ferguson in New Zealand, and even those with a pro-choice leaning have nodded to the fact that these are the most robust research papers that have been done. They all show that in the main that there's a huge risk for the woman with regard to increased levels of anxiety, substance abuse, and increased risk of suicide. So how is a doctor supposed to pretend that doesn't exist and point a woman in this direction, even if he or she has no scruples with the procedure itself? I mean, this is again back to that point that this is not evidence-based medicine. Make no bones about this. Like, this is the state, forcing a political ideology upon medicine.
Now, you said there were, as it stands, a number of hospitals, maternity hospitals, again, were not participating in this service. And they're coming under, I understand, different types of pressure to come into the system. You used a phrase there which jumped out at me. Value, could you address that? Value clarification? What's this?
So there's two modalities by which they're trying to attempt to do this largely. So one is these, as you refer to, the value clarification workshops. So this is essentially an attempt to erode people's conscience and get them to toe the line, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
They're dressed up as a equal opportunity to express opinion and so on like that, but that's nonsense. I have no doubt about it. This is an attempt to just brain train, if you want to call it that. The other suggestion by the 3-year review was that that positive discrimination, as it's referred to, which is a real Orwellian term if you want to look at it, but they're saying that they should have the right, that hospital employers should have the right to positively discriminate against any obstetrician who would be applying for a job if he or she expressed that they may invoke their conscience rights, and they don't see any issue with that. So again, it's scary stuff. Like when you look at it like that, and as I say that, but that's where they're at. And I think this is these are things, I suppose, it always points, Michael, I think, to the horror of what's actually beneath all of this. And again, you have to, I think, they have to use euphemisms, they have to dress it up, they have to misdirect and do all of that, because it's so grotesque, it's so abhorrent what's involved.
So you're not just talking, I mean, about a limited section of the medical world here, are you? Ultimately, like, for example, if you're talking about medical abortion, you're going to require anesthetists, presumably. You're going to require people to carry out who scans. People are going, they're going to involve GPs, you're going to involve gynecologists, obstetricians. So if this becomes a sine qua non of getting a job, ultimately, isn't it going to be a question that you're going to fundamentally just change the nature and this of the profession?
Excuse me. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the moment, it's doctors, nurses, and midwives that have any sense of conscientious protection, as we alluded to earlier on. I mean, others involved, like pharmacists, theatre assistants, as you said, other people involved, like in the chain, they have absolutely no protection. So you're right. I mean, the attempt here is to create a new culture of death, essentially, but one whereby anyway, anyone involved has no scruples with partaking in it. And again, you're right. I mean, this does change the dynamic. We clearly see that. I mean, even before the referendum, Ireland, with its pro-life laws, had one of the best maternity records available around the world. And other countries which had open access to abortion, it was very clear to see that far from saving lives, that actually the standard of care by and large dropped in the hospitals and in the healthcare system. And again, it's no surprise. I mean, if you're devaluing the central elements here, which are someone's right to life, and you're devaluing life itself, I mean, it carries on that would happen.
I'm curious to know, since the legislation has been brought in, and we've heard politicians make noises about numbers and, care and support and all that, have you seen a substantial ramping up of, say, at the level of both practical supports and information? We know there are groups out there, very often they're connected historically to pro-life groups, whether it's Every Life Counts or Janicare or whoever. Has there been a ramping up of support to women in crisis pregnancies? Or is the reality that we say, oh, well, you have the answer now, it's abortion, we don't need to address this? Uh, I'd say at the GP level, I mean, is there information available throughout the system to women who are coming in who are in crisis of where they can get support, or are they actually being forced to go and look for it themselves?
Yeah, I think, and this is a hugely important point. So thus far, the government has paid over 20 million euros in the carrying out of abortion and remunerating those GPs who carry these procedures out. And not a single cent has been spent on the support systems that you refer to. So all of the psychosocial issues that we know from previous research that are at play, that, if we were able to alleviate those pressures, that the vast majority of women would not carry out abortions. There has been no investment there, no investment whatsoever. And there's no attempt to provide GPs with any resources to that effect. The My Options hotline, as it's referred to by the HSE, it's anything but. It's a complete misnomer. I mean, the Students for Life have done a lot of research on this, and unfortunately, those who were even on the fence, who were ringing in with regard to whether they would continue with their pregnancy or not, were all directed to abortion providers. And that's a scary reality. And even you have fabulous institutions and agencies like Janicare, for instance, who have saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives at this point by merely being there for the woman and her baby and surrounding family during the pregnancy, and providing practical and financial support. Minister for the Health at the time of the referendum, Simon Harris, referred to these agencies as rogue agencies. So we're in dark times. That there's no doubt about that. This isn't about helping women. Let's be very, very clear. This is about abandoning women. This is about just trying to tidy things up, and it's extremely clinical. There's no love behind this. I think be very, very clear.
It's a strange dynamic, though, isn't it? It's very weird. I mean, that, for example, you say in the say that the helplines. I've read some of the reports there. They said it's basically funneling in one direction only. It's maybe not a fair question to ask you, but do you have any sense why this push in one direction only, rather than with all the talk we hear? Why is there not shall we say, a genuine support offered, right, for those who want it or those who might benefit from it?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very good question, and a very, very fair question, and a pertinent question. My sense would be that the tidal wave of this is so strong, and the lobby groups see a door having been opened, and they're just pushing. They're just pushing for further access. And I think that, if you start a genuine debate around abortion, you have to start looking at the facts involved. and it becomes very murky at the very least. And people like who are proponents of this know that. So instead of doing that and acknowledging things, they move into a, very unsettling kind of celebratory mood around it, where, let's say, when the first figures were announced for those who had lost their life as a result of abortion, there was a celebration by a lot of the pro-choice and pro-abortion groups for this. So like that's what we're talking about here. Like there needs to be a twisting on their side. There needs to be a corruption of reality and an inversion of principles. And I think they unfortunately we have a government that's it's just they're playing fiddle to them, and that's where we're at. So instead of providing genuine choice, as you say, and you're providing real equality where people make decisions on equal terms, that's not happening. That's absolutely not happening. And I think that we need, as people with a pro-life disposition, we need to be very clear about what we're offering. We believe in a society where every human being is valued. Every human being has equal value with regard to need access to respect, love, and dignity. And that's regardless of one's age, that's regardless of one's stage of life, one's sickness or otherwise, and whether one's disability or otherwise. And I think, we need to be really, really clear that that's where we stand. And any society that begins to accept the idea that any life is not, that any life whatsoever is not worth living, that a life, then I think we move very quickly in a dark, to a dark place. And I think, previous century has shown us that.
Sure. As it stands right now, when we look to the future, first of all, what kind of conscience protections would you like to see being brought in? But on the other hand, what direction do you fear the conscience protections are going? And what's the position being taken by the professional bodies like the College of General Practitioners? To what extent are they supporting GPs in this, developing a response to the political pressures, or are they staying out of this, as it were? So where do you fear it going, and where would you like it to go?
Yeah, so I suppose just to take the last point about where our representative bodies or where they've been at, they haven't been supportive. Let's be very clear. I think when you look at the Irish Medical Council, for instance, at the end of 2018, just before the legislation came into effect, they removed overnight, and this was delivered to us by an email, they removed 2 paragraphs from the ethical guidelines in the Medical Council website, which related to our duty of care to unborn children. And so they said that this was being done to remove any conflict with the new legislation. So I mean, that's again, who's playing fiddle to who there. Like, this is very clear that, those behind this, like the fundamentals, they're being eroded, and they don't seem to care, or at very least, they're not strong enough to stand up to it. And again, as I said, the bizarre thing is that within these guidelines, it very clearly states that a doctor must never take part in the killing of a patient. And yet, we have all these contradictions and enforcement, or attempt at least to enforce doctors to take part. So I think at the moment, where I would like to see the conscience and the protection of freedom of conscience move to is a absolute robust freedom of conscience. And that's not just in the area of abortion, but as it stands in an effort to protect medicine as a profession. I think we need to see a situation where a doctor is genuinely allowed his or her freedom to make clinical decisions based on evidence-based medicine and his or her ethical principles. So that's what I would like to see, and I would like to see it extended beyond doctors, nurses, and midwives, and with no obligation, as I say, to refer, and also, as I say, beyond nurses and midwives to other healthcare professionals as well. My fear, however, and this is based on I suppose the current climate as to where we're at, and the 3-year review being indicative of that, is that we're moving in a direction where, instead of protections being enhanced, we're going to see attempts to further erode them.
Just touching on that, you talked about the wider questions regarding not just abortion, but wider questions like the we know that there are a number of different pieces of legislation going around at the moment. One in particular moving towards legislating for euthanasia in Ireland. We've seen the direction that has taken recently in Canada, where they're now preparing legislation which would allow for people with drug problems and addictions to be killed by the state. The reason, or one of the reasons anyway, this kind of legislation has consistently failed to succeed in the United Kingdom is one reason that's given is the resistance of the professional medical organizations in the UK. There had been an expectation that the same thing would happen here. The palliative care doctors are very opposed. Were you surprised to see the response of the general practitioners?
Not really, because I don't think they're particularly strong. You know, and I think that's something that we learned very clearly in the abortion referendum. I think, you know, it was encouraging, excuse me, as you said, to see the Irish Palliative Medicine Consultants Association very clearly, you know, oppose this legislation. And also the Royal College of Physicians came out against it. In addition to that, again, on a wider level, the World Medical Association, which represents upwards of 10 million physicians in over, I think, 115, 16 countries, you know, they very clearly have a stance which is very much against any movement towards euthanasia. So I think, you know, that's certainly encouraging. But I think, you know, unfortunately, I suppose in the climate that we're in now, you know, there's a move towards personal autonomy reigning supreme, and we've seen that, and that seems to be a move which has no real consideration for wider society. You know, it has a notional reference to it, but in reality, there's no real consideration of it. And I think, you know, when you look at COVID and we look at even the wider climate situation, like, it's very clear that we're a society that's woven together and that we're interdependent and that our actions are very much you know, have a rippling effect on others, and we can't get away from that. And I think that, you know, very clearly, and I think you mentioned this at the start, that, you know, when any jurisdiction has attempted to bring in euthanasia, they've always brought in these safeguards in an attempt to you know, really limit the numbers. Yet we've seen that on the average for all the jurisdictions, that the numbers have gone up tenfold. You know, in a matter of a very short number of years. And Canada, you know, really epitomizes that, like you mentioned. And I think, again, and it's wider than just the numbers themselves. Like you see in the Netherlands, you know, that the suicide numbers, even aside from whether it be euthanasia or assisted suicide, but the general suicide numbers have gone up by about 35%. You know, when you make something, you know, banal, or when you kind of you know, try and take away the stigma essentially from it, you know, it hugely undermines the great work that's been done by so many to you know, prevent suicides, and it just makes, you know, the vulnerable people in our society, you know, even more vulnerable. You know, we were talking about the elderly, those with disabilities. I mean, it's very clear that this is where this movement goes.
Ultimately, do you think it's possible to go down this line without ultimately entering into what it becomes an economic discussion? That we start to see, and I think, is this a concern for you as a doctor, that this fundamentally changes medicine, that rather than you're looking at the patient simply as a person that you're trying to care for, but rather that you're starting to make economic decisions about who is more valuable or who is more expensive?
Yeah, I think when you move away from the central tenet of our society, that each human being has equal value, then I think that starts to happen very, very quickly. You know, and when you look at states like California, in America, you have insurance companies that are not willing to pay for someone's chemotherapy, but they'll pay for the drugs necessary for assisted suicide or euthanasia. You know, and I think it just, as I said, erodes the supportive nature of a society. And you know, you start to see cases where people are applying for euthanasia and succeeding in doing so on the basis of life completion, or lockdown loneliness and mental health disorders. And I'm just again bewildered by the likes of, let's say, Pieta House or these other institutions which have again done huge work to prevent suicide and to help those who are in those really troubling situations. And there seems to be this general wider support for that, but a refusal to see the contradiction of where we're potentially moving with this euthanasia legislation.
Listen, Brendan, I'm aware that we've taken up a little bit more time than we had promised. I'd like to thank you I suspect we'll be talking again because these issues aren't going to go away, and certainly with the issues around euthanasia. But for tonight, I'd like to thank Dr. Brendan Crowley for joining us. I'd like to thank you for coming in to join the webinar. Again, I'd invite you to hit the old subscribe button, and anything you can give and that donate will be used to the best of our ability to defend those life values that we all share. Thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Brendan.
Thank you, Michael.